For the sixth time, Stephen Miller's voice cut through the room, sharp, impatient, drenched in authority that no one had given him. Cameras blinked red. The air inside the chamber felt thick, like even oxygen had stopped to listen. Miller leaned forward, his tone slicing through the microphone again, a rehearsed rhythm of interruption he'd perfected over years of shouting others down. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, her posture unflinching, her gaze steady, the stillness of someone who had seen this kind of power before, and learned how to let it burn itself out. His words rolled over her like static. "If you'd let me finish," he began, only to cut her off again before she even opened her mouth. Laughter rippled through one corner of the crowd, uneasy, nervous laughter that didn't reach their eyes. This wasn't a debate anymore, it was dominance theater. But the cameras were still rolling, and the internet never blinked. Jasmine's hand rested gently on the table. Not clenched, not shaking. Just resting. Her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. Every interruption, every sneer, every attempt to bulldoze her voice was fuel collecting behind her calm. Miller smirked, sensing advantage. "See, this is the problem," he declared, voice rising, chin tilted toward the lights. "You people never answer the question directly." The words hung there, "you people," and even the technicians in the back looked up. Someone exhaled sharply. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her eyes shifted, just slightly, and for the first time, Miller's expression faltered. The moderator cleared his throat, but it didn't matter anymore. The room's gravity had shifted. Every camera lens pointed not at the man still talking, but at the woman who hadn't yet spoken, and then, stillness. No words. Just Crockett's quiet inhale, a small, deliberate pause that told every viewer watching, something was coming. Miller pushed again, louder now, desperate to fill the silence. "Go ahead, Congresswoman. Enlighten us." The pause stretched, electric. The hum of lights, the faint buzz of microphones, even Miller's tapping fingers, all merged into one sound, expectation. Jasmine lifted her eyes, voice low but firm. "You've had your 6 turns, Mr. Miller." She leaned forward slightly, a calm fire in her gaze. No one expected her 7th line to silence him completely. What unfolded in that room wasn't just another heated exchange, it was a snapshot of America's most enduring fault lines. Power. Race. Respect. The right to speak without being shouted down. The right to exist without explanation. On the surface, it looked like two people trading barbs, but underneath, it was centuries of history pressing against the present. Stephen Miller wasn't just a commentator that day, he was the embodiment of an ideology, sharp suits and sharper interruptions, a man who learned that confidence could often masquerade as truth if delivered loudly enough. His career had been built on dominance, policy papers, press briefings, and sound bites that treated human dignity like a political experiment. His gift wasn't persuasion, it was provocation. He didn't argue to understand. He argued to win. Jasmine Crockett was his opposite in every way that mattered. A first-term congresswoman, a lawyer who'd spent her life fighting on behalf of people without the luxury of microphones or cameras. Where Miller's power came from privilege and proximity, hers came from perseverance and earned respect. She knew the language of injustice intimately, the tone, the body language, the way arrogance could dress itself as civility, and yet, here they were, facing each other in front of millions. The clip hadn't even finished airing before fragments of it began flooding timelines. On Twitter, edits appeared within minutes. Miller interrupts again, one read, paired with a looping 6-second video of his hand cutting through her words. On TikTok, creators slowed down Jasmine's calm expressions, setting them to suspenseful music. On Reddit, a thread titled "The Moment She Snapped, and He Knew It" began gaining thousands of upvotes. Cable networks pounced. Commentators replayed the interruptions on split screens, arguing whether this was passion or patronizing. But what most people saw wasn't policy, it was power imbalance. A white male strategist accustomed to control, meeting a black congresswoman who refused to surrender her composure. The symbolism wrote itself. By nightfall, hashtags told the story better than headlines ever could. Hashtag let her speak, hashtag the 7th line, hashtag Crockett versus Miller. For many viewers, it wasn't about politics, it was personal. They saw their teachers, mothers, sisters, and daughters in Jasmine's poise. They saw their bosses, professors, and pundits in Miller's interruptions. It became a mirror for every conversation where someone was talked over, dismissed, or reduced. Journalists described it as the clash of two Americas. Commentators framed it as the new civil theater, where the old guard of domination was finally being challenged by a generation that refused to yield their dignity. And yet, the question lingered, could calm really conquer condescension? Could silence, used with purpose, be more powerful than volume? That question is what made the clip viral. It wasn't just the interruptions, it was the anticipation. The nation was collectively holding its breath, waiting for the moment she'd finally answer back. That tension lived something deeper than politics. It was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this one exchange could tip a cultural balance. Because when someone like Jasmine Crockett held her ground against someone like Stephen Miller, it wasn't just her voice that mattered, it was everyone who'd ever been told to stay quiet. And as the video views climbed, 1 million, 2 million, 5, the anticipation turned electric. People weren't just watching for entertainment anymore. They were waiting for redemption. What happened next would redefine how millions viewed political discourse. Long before the cameras caught his sixth interruption, Stephen Miller had built a career on mastering the art of control. Every sentence he'd ever spoken in public was an act of theater, timed, rehearsed, sharpened like a blade meant not to persuade but to puncture. He wasn't born into quiet rooms, he was raised in ideological arenas where shouting was strategy and dominance was discipline. At Duke University, he'd already developed the cadence that would later define him, part preacher, part prosecutor, always certain. His classmates remembered his speeches, fueled by grievance, polished by confidence. He thrived on friction, the thrill of confrontation. While others debated to learn, Miller debated to win. He wasn't chasing understanding. He was crafting spectacle. By the time he entered Washington, he had become fluent in the language of outrage. As a senior advisor in the White House, he engineered policies that turned entire communities into political talking points. He saw human pain not as tragedy but as proof of toughness. Every press conference was a duel, every interview, a battlefield. And when words failed to sway, he discovered something more potent, interruption. Interrupting was his weapon of choice. It wasn't mere rudeness, it was strategy. He'd studied how breaking rhythm broke confidence. How inserting his voice between someone else's thought could make their argument crumble before it even formed. The Miller method, as some aides jokingly called it, was built on psychological dominance. Talk over, talk fast, talk loud. Leave no space for reflection. Replace reason with rhythm. It worked, until it didn't. The transformation from strategist to pundit had given him more airtime, but less restraint. Free from the discipline of government halls, Miller became addicted to provocation. He learned that outrage was currency in the new media economy. Clips of him dismantling opponents fed his brand. To his supporters, he was fearless. To his critics, he was venom wrapped in intellect. And both sides kept watching. The 6 interruptions that night weren't slips of temper, they were choreography. Each one calculated to derail, to remind the audience who held the verbal upper hand. It was the same playbook he'd used on cable panels for years: cut, redirect, dominate. His pauses were deliberate too, the smug smile after a jab, the tilted chin that said "this is my stage." But arrogance has a rhythm, and it's one that eventually exposes itself. By the 4th interruption, the crowd's energy had shifted. It wasn't admiration anymore, it was unease. The laughter after his first snide remark had thinned into silence. By the 5th, even the moderator's forced politeness began to sound strained. Still, Miller pressed on. His confidence was not born of awareness but of momentum. He believed that if he just kept talking, truth would drown beneath performance. He had done it countless times before, with senators, journalists, professors. People who thought logic could tame arrogance. They always underestimated how much noise the world was willing to forgive when it came wrapped in certainty. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't like them. From the moment she entered the conversation, she didn't flinch. She didn't reach for rebuttals or raise her tone to compete. She simply waited. And that waiting, the stillness in her eyes, unnerved him in a way no opposition ever had. For the first time, interruption didn't bend the atmosphere his way. His words bounced off composure instead of cowering it. The control he'd counted on began to fray. He leaned harder into habit. "Excuse me, but," he'd start, slicing through her sentences like punctuation marks of power. Each time, he expected her to break rhythm, to stumble, to show frustration. But she never did. The calm became unbearable. The silence, deafening. He didn't know it yet, but the spectacle he was building was turning against him. The very tactics that once made him the center of gravity now exposed his insecurity. What once read as dominance now looked like desperation. Viewers saw it. Even in real time, the shift was visible. His gestures grew sharper, his tone more clipped, his smile more forced. The confidence that used to fill a room now seemed to shrink inside it. Miller's genius had always been control, control of words, control of space, control of perception. But control is a fragile illusion when it depends on the silence of others, and on that night, for the first time, he met someone who refused to provide it. His voice, once so sure, began to echo into a room that no longer rewarded its volume. The crowd wasn't reacting to him anymore. They were waiting for her, and as the sixth interruption fell flat, a strange quiet settled over the stage. Stephen Miller, the architect of arrogance, the man who had made a career of commanding conversations, had finally met resistance he couldn't bulldoze. Before the cameras and the headlines, Jasmine Crockett's world was built on small rooms, long nights, and the relentless belief that truth deserved a voice. Born and raised in Texas, she came from the kind of place where respect wasn't given freely, you earned it, often the hard way. Her childhood wasn't gilded by privilege but by grit. Her mother worked 2 jobs, her father taught her that silence could be powerful, but it was never meant to mean surrender. Dallas in summer heat had a rhythm all its own, sirens, sermons, and songs of survival. Jasmine grew up between all 3. Sundays meant church pews and speeches about faith stronger than fear. Weekdays meant classrooms where she was often the only black girl in the room, learning early what it meant to be spoken over, underestimated, or politely dismissed. Every time a teacher ignored her raised hand, every time a classmate mocked her voice, she stored those moments, not as bitterness, but as fuel. When she chose law, it wasn't ambition, it was obligation. The kind of duty born from watching injustice up close. After earning her degree, she didn't head for a cushy firm in a glass tower. She opened a small office in Dallas, the kind with flickering lights and worn-out chairs, defending people who couldn't afford anyone else. Protesters, tenants, workers, those who needed not just legal counsel but dignity restored. She wasn't chasing headlines. She was chasing fairness. There were days she lost more cases than she won. But in every courtroom, she learned something no textbook could teach: composure is its own form of power. The louder her opponents got, the calmer she became. When prosecutors raised their voices, she measured her tone. When judges rolled their eyes, she held theirs with steady focus. It wasn't strategy, it was survival. Once, early in her career, a district attorney mocked her pronunciation of a legal term during a hearing. The room chuckled. Jasmine didn't. She waited for silence, then repeated the word perfectly, her voice like glass, clear, controlled, unbroken. That day, she learned something essential: arrogance feeds on reaction. Starve it, and it starves itself. Those who knew her outside politics would say she carried storms quietly. She'd walk into community centers, listen more than she spoke, and when she finally did speak, it was with a precision that made even cynics stop scrolling. She doesn't raise her voice, one volunteer once said. She raises the room. So when Jasmine Crockett ran for office, it wasn't out of desire for fame, it was inevitability. She was the kind of leader who rose not from privilege but from exhaustion of watching people like her silenced by those who never had to fight for a microphone. Her campaign was simple: justice that listens. People laughed at that slogan at first. Then they saw her in action. Her first congressional hearing was a test. Surrounded by veterans of the political stage, she was the newcomer, the outsider, the young black woman they assumed could be out-talked. But that day, she didn't just speak, she dismantled. Piece by piece, calmly, methodically, until every smirk on that panel turned into quiet respect. The footage went viral not because she shouted anyone down, but because she didn't. It wasn't that she enjoyed confrontation. She simply refused to be owned by it. When her colleagues spoke of Stephen Miller before the debate, they warned her. He'll talk over you. He'll bait you. Don't let him rattle you. She'd smiled and replied, he can't rattle what's rooted. Because that's what she was, rooted. In faith, in purpose, in the lived experience of every woman who's ever had to find calm inside chaos. Behind that debate stage, just minutes before going live, she adjusted her blazer, glanced at her reflection, and thought of her mother's old saying, still waters cut deeper than waves. The producers counted down, 5, 4, 3, and as the lights flared, she exhaled slowly. When Miller's first interruption came, she didn't react. The second, she took a note. The third, her eyes flickered with recognition, that kind of man. By the fourth, she'd mapped his rhythm. By the fifth, she'd memorized his insecurity. And by the sixth, she was ready, because every courtroom where she'd been underestimated, every headline that twisted her intent, every condescending smile she'd met with silence, had been training for this. She wasn't facing just Stephen Miller that night. She was facing every voice that ever told her she didn't belong in the room. And the truth was, she had learned how to stay in rooms like that long after louder men had exhausted themselves. Her calm wasn't weakness, it was preparation. It was the kind of strength that doesn't need validation to exist. As the debate wore on and Miller's interruptions multiplied, the nation saw two people, but Jasmine saw only one challenge: how long she could let arrogance talk before it defeated itself. The crowd didn't know it yet. Neither did Miller. But Jasmine Crockett was about to remind America what composure looks like when courage wears a quiet face. Every courtroom, every injustice, every interruption, had prepared her for this exact moment. The lights burned hotter now, flooding every crease of expression. The air inside the chamber had changed, no longer the neutral hum of political theater, but a quiet tension that vibrated under every sentence. The moderator's voice had grown tight, cautious, like a conductor losing control of an orchestra mid-performance. Stephen Miller leaned forward again, elbows on the table, lips curled in a half-smile that never reached his eyes. Congresswoman, let me, Mr. Miller, if I could just finish my, he cut in before she could. No, see, this is exactly the problem. You want to make everything personal, but we're here to talk facts, not feelings. The words facts, not feelings echoed off the walls like a cue for applause, but none came. A few uneasy coughs scattered through the audience. Even the cameraman hesitated to zoom in, sensing the heat shifting between them. Jasmine sat motionless. Not frozen, not startled, measured. Her hands stayed clasped, her posture upright, her gaze fixed on him with an expression that bordered on surgical detachment. Behind that calm, though, something alive flickered. Miller wasn't used to silence that didn't cower. He mistook it for opportunity. He laughed softly, shaking his head, his tone dripping with that familiar brand of mock politeness. You know, Congresswoman, every time I try to engage you on policy, you pivot to emotion. Maybe that works in campaign rallies, but not here. He raised his hand slightly as if conducting his own point, eyes darting to the moderator for validation that never came. His confidence fed on repetition. Interruption was his rhythm, and the rhythm was breaking. Crockett inhaled slowly. Around her, whispers rippled, staffers, journalists, even aides glancing up from their notes. One camera light blinked to red again, ready to catch what it somehow knew was coming. The moderator attempted to step in. Mr. Miller, let's give the Congresswoman. Miller talked over him too. I'm just saying, if we can't discuss these issues without someone playing the victim card, that word, victim, hung in the air like a spark waiting for oxygen. A woman in the second row shifted uncomfortably. Another leaned forward, whispering, did he just? Jasmine blinked once. That was all. One slow blink. And when her eyes opened again, the stillness around her turned heavy, magnetic. Miller kept going, filling the silence with noise. People are tired of the same identity politics. We want solutions, not sound bites. You keep acting like every disagreement is some grand moral crusade. It's not. Each line was louder than the last, his gestures sharper, his face flushed under the studio lights. The crowd wasn't reacting anymore, they were watching. The kind of watching that happens when everyone feels the moment tightening, but no one dares interrupt its build. Jasmine shifted her pen slightly on the table. The smallest motion, yet it pulled focus like thunder in a whisper. "Mr. Miller," she said softly. He spoke over her again. "No, see, this is exactly, Mr. Miller." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was the voice of someone who had heard every variation of arrogance and catalogued them all. The room fell still. Even the hum of the lights seemed to dim. "You've interrupted me 6 times, she said, not accusingly but as if stating evidence before a court. 6 times in the span of 10 minutes. He leaned back, smirking, unbothered, or pretending to be. "Well, if you'd actually answer the question," she looked at him then, fully, and something in that look made his words stumble before leaving his mouth. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was the inhale before the storm. The moderator's eyes flicked between them, unsure whether to intervene or let the tension run its course. Cameras zoomed in, catching the faint glimmer in Jasmine's eyes, the unshaken control in her expression. Miller exhaled, mistaking her calm for weakness. He was wrong. What no one in the room understood, what millions would soon see replayed again and again, was that this pause, this breath, this moment of stillness was not hesitation. It was precision, and when she finally exhaled, her next words would shift the energy of the entire room. But not yet. For now, the only sound was the heartbeat of expectation, the hum of lights, and the quiet before a storm America would never forget. For a heartbeat, time forgot to move. The debate stage had become a vacuum, no rustling papers, no murmuring audience, no shuffling shoes. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath, their lenses locked on Jasmine Crockett's stillness. She sat poised, her shoulders squared, her eyes fixed on Stephen Miller with the quiet certainty of someone who had finally decided to stop letting the storm dictate the weather. "Mr. Miller," she began, her tone even, deliberate, the kind of controlled calm that makes everyone lean closer. He opened his mouth to interrupt again, reflex, instinct, but something in her delivery froze him mid-breath. She didn't rush. She let the silence hang, an invisible hand tightening the air. "When you interrupt women this often," she continued, voice smooth as glass, "it doesn't make you strong." A pause. A single, surgical pause that cut sharper than any shout. "It makes you small." The words landed like a gavel. Not shouted, not dramatized, simply spoken, and that simplicity made them lethal. For a moment, the only sound was the faint electrical hum of the stage lights. Then the crowd exhaled as if released from a collective spell. A few gasps rippled through the audience, small, involuntary sounds of shock and satisfaction colliding. A woman near the front covered her mouth. Someone in the press row whispered, "Oh my God," she said it. Stephen Miller blinked, trying to mask the flicker of disbelief that crossed his face. For a man so rehearsed in control, the expression was unmistakable, confusion edged with humiliation. His smirk faltered, then stiffened, a malfunction in his carefully engineered demeanor. Jasmine didn't press further. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply looked at him, letting the silence bloom like a verdict. The moderator, uncertain whether to speak, glanced between them. His hand hovered over his cue cards. Congresswoman, would you like to continue?" She nodded once. "Thank you." That was it. No theatrics, no raised tone. Just the authority of composure reclaiming its rightful space. Stephen tried to recover. He chuckled, dry and brittle. "Well, that's certainly one way to interpret it," he said, forcing a smile that didn't survive its journey to his eyes. He adjusted his papers, looking down to escape her gaze, but it was too late. The energy had shifted completely. The audience, once hesitant to react, now rode a wave of recognition. They had just witnessed something that transcended the usual noise of punditry. It wasn't just a counter-argument, it was a reclamation. Cameras zoomed in, catching every detail, Jasmine's calm expression, the unbroken eye contact, Miller's faltering grin. The clip would later be dissected frame by frame, journalists, body language experts, TikTok editors, all analyzing the moment. Composure became revolution. The young woman in the audience whispered, "That's the line," to her friend. That's the one that's gonna go viral. And she was right. Across the country, within hours, the clip would dominate every feed. But right now, right here, it was still forming, a live spark traveling through silence. Jasmine continued speaking, not to Miller, but to the audience. We can disagree, she said softly, but if we can't listen, then what are we even doing here? Debate isn't a war of volume, it's a test of respect. Her words weren't barbs, they were balance. A subtle reminder that dignity wasn't weakness, it was endurance. Miller shifted in his chair, his body betraying him. He tried to interject again, but the moderator raised his hand this time. Let her finish, please. For once, Miller obeyed. Jasmine went on. I was raised to believe that real strength is measured not by how loudly you talk over others, but how deeply you can hear them. Maybe that's something we've forgotten in this country. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in applause that felt earned. A rare, human kind of applause. Even some of the aides who had been stone-faced moments before found themselves nodding. Miller looked down, his smirk entirely gone. The camera caught the subtle twitch of his jaw, the way he pressed his lips together as if trying to chew back the moment. In the control room, a producer whispered into his headset, clip that. That's the viral mark, timestamp it now. And just like that, history began its replication. By the time the debate ended, the quote had already escaped into the digital bloodstream. Someone in the audience had uploaded a 14-second clip to X, Twitter. Caption, she ended him with one sentence. Within minutes, it was retweeted thousands of times. On TikTok, users slowed down her delivery, set it to dramatic orchestral music. When you interrupt women this often, beat, it doesn't make you strong. It makes you small. The line became mantra. Meme. Movement. Cable networks replayed it by morning. Morning shows debated whether it was overly personal or perfectly poetic. But for most Americans watching, it was neither. It was overdue. In that single line, Jasmine Crockett had spoken for every woman who had been cut off in meetings, every activist dismissed as emotional, every voice told to wait its turn. Meanwhile, Stephen Miller remained quiet. The next day, in a radio interview, when asked about the exchange, he brushed it off with a laugh. I've been interrupted before, he said. But even through the audio, the tightness in his tone betrayed him, because what she'd said wasn't just about him, it was about the entire structure of power he represented. And deep down, he knew that Crockett's composure had exposed something words rarely could, arrogance collapsing under the weight of its own noise. When journalists later asked Jasmine if she'd planned the line, she smiled. No, she said. He just gave me 6 reasons to say it. And that's what made it unforgettable. It wasn't scripted, it was earned. The crowd, the country, the cameras, everyone understood at point. 6 interruptions. 6 attempts to dominate and 1 calm, measured line that dismantled them all. As the lights dimmed and the audience filed out, Miller stayed seated a moment longer, flipping through his notes, pretending to look busy. But the stage lights had already shifted their allegiance. Crockett stood, shook the moderator's hand, and walked off without a backward glance. No victory speech, no triumphant smirk, just quiet grace. And with that, 6 interruptions vanished into one unforgettable line. The moment Jasmine Crockett uttered that 7th line, the echo didn't end in the debate hall, it detonated across the digital universe. Within minutes, the clip became a spark racing through millions of screens. Someone in the front row had already posted it to X with the caption, she didn't raise her voice. She raised the bar. Hashtag 7th line. It spread like voltage. On TikTok, creators stitched their reactions, one mouthing her words in slow motion, another syncing them to a rising orchestral swell. When you interrupt women this often, flashed across the screen in bold white text, followed by, it doesn't make you strong, it makes you small. Thousands of comments poured in beneath each post, goosebumps. Say it again for every boardroom and classroom. This is history, not politics. On YouTube, political commentary channels uploaded breakdowns within hours. Titles popped up like headlines from a new cultural chapter, the moment Stephen Miller's arrogance met its match. Crockett's calm, how dignity destroys demagoguery. The 7th line heard around America. Each video replayed the same 14-second stretch in slow motion: Jasmine's stillness, Miller's falter, the audience's stunned silence. Analysts paused frames, circled body language cues, dissected tone and timing as if reviewing a championship knockout. "This isn't just a debate clip," one host said over swelling music. "It's a cultural reset." By dawn, #7th line had crossed 100 million views. Memes turned it into legend. A viral edit showed Jasmine standing still as hurricanes, earthquakes, and headlines swirled around her. Caption: "Calm is the new revolution." Another featured her quote over grainy footage of historical trailblazers, blending eras of defiance into one moment of truth. Late-night hosts joined in, balancing humor with reverence. On The Daily Show, the joke landed sharp: Stephen Miller interrupted a congresswoman 6 times. Then she interrupted his entire career. Laughter erupted, but it was the next line that drew applause: "Sometimes silence doesn't mean you lost your words, it means you're about to choose the right ones." Cable pundits scrambled to claim their angles. Conservative panels framed it as overreaction, questioning whether the viral moment was manufactured outrage. But even among their ranks, the tone had shifted. One commentator hesitated mid-sentence before admitting, "It's hard to defend constant interruption when the optics are this bad." Meanwhile, progressives treated the clip as collective catharsis. For women, it was vindication; for people of color, validation. The digital space became an open diary of shared experiences. Under the hashtag, countless users wrote, "Every time I was talked over in a meeting, this moment healed something." She didn't just speak for women, she spoke for anyone ever told to stay polite while being disrespected. Influencers, journalists, even musicians joined the chorus. A popular R&B artist tweeted, "She just dropped the most powerful diss track of the year, and it wasn't even a song." Within 24 hours, the clip reached the White House press pool. A reporter asked a spokesperson for comment. The reply was careful but telling: "Every voice deserves to be heard. Respect is not optional in democracy." The phrase became another trending tagline: "Respect is not optional." Shirts appeared on Etsy overnight. Designers posted minimalist posters featuring Jasmine's silhouette and the quote in bold serif font. It wasn't fandom, it was cultural symbolism. And Stephen Miller? His team went silent. No press statements, no tweets. Silence, the one thing he had refused to allow anyone else, was now the only thing surrounding him. By the second day, think pieces filled editorial pages. The Atlantic wrote, "In an age of performative outrage, Crockett reminded America that composure can be its own revolution." Rolling Stone called her a new archetype of defiance, the still voice that dismantles noise. On the evening of the third day, Jasmine posted a single message: "Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it just waits for its turn." No hashtags. No emojis. Within an hour, the post had over 2 million likes, and then came the montage. One creator compiled decades of interruptions, clips of women politicians, journalists, and activists being cut off, ending with Jasmine's 7th line as the final crescendo. The caption read, "This is what progress looks like, a full circle of unfinished sentences finally ending." It became more than a moment, it became a mirror. The clash between Miller and Crockett wasn't about policy anymore. It was about America's oldest argument: who gets to speak, and who gets to be heard. And every repost, every remix, every think piece, that theme rang clear. It wasn't her tone or timing that won, it was what it represented. Dignity surviving in a space designed to humiliate it. Calm standing its ground against chaos. For once, the internet didn't just react, it reflected. The noise had become a conversation, the conversation a reckoning, and at its center stood a woman who didn't have to raise her voice to raise the standard. In the days that followed, as the noise of commentary faded and the trending tags slowed, what remained wasn't outrage, it was resonance. The clip of Jasmine Crockett and Stephen Miller became more than a viral moment, it became a study in power. Not the kind measured by microphones or airtime, but the kind rooted in stillness, the quiet conviction that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. People replayed that 14-second exchange not for drama, but for something deeper. It reminded them that composure is a form of courage, and that in a world addicted to chaos, calm has become revolutionary. For every person who had ever been interrupted, dismissed, or disrespected, her pause became their vindication, because that's what Jasmine Crockett's victory really was, a victory for silence reclaimed. For dignity redefined. She didn't just correct Stephen Miller, she corrected the culture that rewarded his behavior. She didn't win because she was louder, she won because she didn't need to be across living rooms, classrooms, and board meetings. Her words echoed like a mantra. It doesn't make you strong, it makes you small. Those weren't just words to one man, they were a truth addressed to every space where arrogance mistook volume for value. And yet, what made her win so profound was not humiliation, it was humanity. Even as the world cheered her takedown, Jasmine never gloated. When asked later how it felt to destroy Stephen Miller, she simply smiled and said, "I didn't destroy anyone. I just reminded him that I belong here, too." That's the kind of strength that doesn't expire when the clip stops playing. It lingers, reshaping how people think about respect, power, and the ways we fight for both. Her message reached far beyond politics. Teachers played the clip in classrooms to show what grace under fire looks like. Parents shared it with daughters learning how to speak up. Even in corporate trainings, her moment was cited as an example of emotional intelligence in leadership. The power of her response wasn't in its sharpness, it was in its steadiness. It proved that sometimes the greatest disruption isn't noise, but restraint. That calm, when wielded with confidence, can dismantle everything arrogance builds, because the truth is simple, and she embodied it. The power of a calm mind will always outlast the noise of an angry one. That idea struck a collective nerve. In a nation oversaturated with shouting matches and televised outrage, Jasmine Crockett's poise reminded people that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it breathes, waits, and then speaks once, with precision that reverberates louder than any insult could. Her triumph wasn't about politics, it was about principle. About a universal longing for decency, equality, and grace. She didn't need to represent every voice to empower them, she only had to remind them that respect isn't granted by the loudest person in the room, it's claimed by the calmest. In the end, the clash between Miller and Crockett stopped being a debate. It became a parable, a lesson about what happens when conviction meets chaos and chooses not to surrender its peace. For those watching at home, it wasn't just entertaining. It was instructive. A reminder that in every argument, meeting, or moment of confrontation, you can choose to hold your ground without losing your grace. Your voice doesn't need volume, it needs clarity, and clarity, when it's rooted in truth, cuts through any amount of noise. So when history looks back at that seventh line, it won't remember it as an insult or even a clapback, it will remember it as a turning point. The moment dignity won, not through dominance. Not through destruction, but through composure, the quietest, strongest weapon there is. In the end, this wasn't just a debate, it was a reminder. A reminder that truth, spoken calmly, can dismantle even the loudest arrogance. From the first interruption to the final silence, Jasmine Crockett showed America what composure under fire truly looks like. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to match chaos with chaos. She simply waited for her moment, and when it came, her seventh line destroyed him, not with anger, but with truth. That's what people will remember. Not the interruptions. Not the smirks. But the moment dignity stood its ground and refused to bow. The moment one sentence shifted the entire balance of power on live television. Her victory wasn't about humiliation, it was about elevation. It was the triumph of stillness over noise, clarity over confusion, respect over ego. She didn't just win an argument, she reminded a divided nation that integrity still has a place in public life, because at its heart, this story isn't about Stephen Miller or Jasmine Crockett, it's about us. About the kind of country we want to live in, the kind of conversations we want to have, and the kind of strength we choose to admire. So if you believe words still matter in America, hit subscribe and stand for those who speak with purpose. Let this story be a spark, a reminder that our democracy depends not on who shouts the loudest, but on who speaks the truth the clearest. And when the world feels too noisy, when arrogance seems to fill every room, remember, silence isn't weakness, it's preparation, because sometimes, all it takes is one calm voice, and one perfect line, to change everything.